On the night of January 30th, 1945, standing at the periscope of the Soviet submarine S-13, Captain Alexander Marinesko saw only what war had trained him to see. A large hull, painted naval gray, running lights where none should have been, and the shapes of guns along its iced-over deck. For 3 weeks, he'd searched the Baltic in worsening weather, waiting for a target big enough to silence the officers who wanted him court-martialed. This one fell the lens. Slow, steady, thousands of tons of German steel pushing west, away from the Red Army. His hands tightened on the grips. 4 torpedoes waited in their tubes, each one chocked with the promise of revenge, and one pull from starting the deadliest night the sea had ever seen. Wilhelm Gustloff began as a gleaming symbol of Nazi ambition. It was a 208-meter cruise liner built for the Strength Through Joy program and personally renamed by Hitler after the assassinated party official Wilhelm Gustloff. In the years before the war, she carried more than 80,000 Germans on subsidized holiday voyages to Norway, Italy, and the Madeira Islands, becoming a floating showcase of the regime's prosperity and pride. However, as the war dragged on, she was recommissioned as a hospital ship until November 1940, when the Allied naval blockade forced Germany to repurpose her as a stationary barrack ship. Moored at the port of Gotenhafen, she housed around 1,000 U-boat trainees from the 2nd Submarine Training Division. That changed in early 1945, when the Eastern Front collapsed. The Soviet Vistula Oder and the East Prussian offensives smashed through Germany's remaining defenses, cutting deep into East Prussia and leaving behind a landscape of burning villages and shattered lines. The Red Army advanced with overwhelming strength, its soldiers, tanks, and artillery outnumbering the Germans 5 or 6 to 1. After years of fighting, the Wehrmacht was spent. Its forces were depleted, its supplies nearly gone, and its air support all but vanished. When the Soviet barrage began, German command structures crumbled. Entire divisions disintegrated under the onslaught, and behind the front, civilians bore the cost. The roads of East Prussia were filled with refugees, carts, and wounded soldiers as artillery echoed ever closer. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. The Soviet advance gathered speed with each passing day, and the scattered remnants of the Wehrmacht could no longer hold the line. The Nazi regime had delayed the evacuation of civilians as long as possible, fearing that such a move would further damage morale among already demoralized soldiers. However, as it became clear that the Red Army could not be stopped, and news of Soviet reprisals spread, pressure to evacuate became unbearable. As the Soviets neared Königsberg, Danzig, and Gotenhafen, panic became uncontrollable. Hitler's order to hold every square inch was abandoned. Both Nazi propaganda and real reports of violence fueled panic. Stories of Soviet soldiers taking revenge, looting homes, assaulting civilians, and indiscriminately executing them spread quickly, pushing millions to flee before the Red Army reached their towns. By late January, most of East Prussia was lost. The 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts cut through Königsberg and along the Baltic coast, trapping both soldiers and civilians. Army Group Center, reorganized as Army Group North in early 1945, was isolated in a shrinking pocket of resistance, its lines disintegrating faster than Berlin could react. In response, Admiral Karl Dönitz launched Operation Hannibal, a massive effort to evacuate soldiers and civilians from the eastern territories. Starting on July 23, 1945, an immense and desperate evacuation across the frozen Baltic Sea began. The mission's aim was twofold: to withdraw trapped German forces from East Prussia, West Prussia, and Pomerania, and to carry terrified civilians away from the advancing Red Army. At first, the evacuation was meant to be orderly. Passengers were registered and ticketed before boarding ships at ports such as Danzig, Pillau, and Gotenhafen. However, as Soviet forces closed in, the procedure broke down. The docks became scenes of mayhem as thousands of people surged toward the ships, crying, shoving, and begging for passage as explosions echoed in the distance. As the operation expanded, the German High Command began to grasp the scale of what was unfolding. Between 1 and 2 million people, nearly 900,000 civilians, and 350,000 soldiers would be loaded aboard every available vessel: warships, merchant liners, ferries, trawlers, even fishing boats and river barges. Dönitz placed the operation under Rear Admiral Konrad Engelhardt and Admiral Oskar Kummetz, who struggled to coordinate convoys through snow, ice, and constant air raids. On the frozen docks, soldiers shouted orders over the roar of the crowd, while cranes lifted the wounded onto decks crammed with families. The port of Gotenhafen, once a major naval base, had become a mass of humanity. Tens of thousands pressed against the piers, begging for a place on any vessel that could still sail. The Baltic offered a narrow path to safety, but its waters were thick with ice and mines, and Soviet submarines prowled below. By the time Wilhelm Gustloff was ready to depart, the situation had collapsed. On the evening of January 30th, 1945, refugees flooded the snow-covered docks of Gotenhafen, pushing through the cold and smoke in a frantic struggle to reach Wilhelm Gustloff. At first, the crew attempted to maintain order, allowing only those with proper papers or tickets to board. The effort lasted only moments. As the crowd grew and panic took hold, control vanished. Procedures were abandoned, and every inch of space on the ship, cabins, corridors, storage rooms, was claimed by those desperate to escape. Everyone in Gotenhafen was cold, hungry, and exhausted. Mothers carried sleeping children wrapped in blankets stiff with frost. Soldiers stumbled under the weight of their packs. Gustloff groaned as more and more people spilled aboard. The ship had been built to carry fewer than 2,000 passengers during her peacetime cruises. Now, there were so many bodies pressed together that the air itself seemed to thin. There was no way to keep an accurate manifest, but estimates put the number of passengers at around 10,000. Cabins meant for 2 now had 10. Families lay shoulder to shoulder in narrow corridors and storage rooms. The old dining hall and cinema were packed with people sitting on the floor, and even the drained swimming pool had been boarded over to make room for hundreds more. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat and diesel. Condensation froze into thin sheets of ice along the walls. Outside, the last of the crowd still pounded on the hull, begging for space that no longer existed. On board, the crew moved through the dim corridors, stepping over sleeping bodies as they tried to prepare the ship for departure. Above deck, sailors scraped snow and ice from the lifeboats, their hands numb and smarting in the freezing air. Snow and wind battered the harbor, making navigation nearly impossible. Yet the same storm that blinded them also promised cover from Soviet periscopes. The officers agreed that their best chance was to run straight across the open sea before the Red Army could close in. As they were readying their departure, from the loudspeakers came Hitler's final radio address, his voice faint and distorted, urging resistance even as his empire collapsed. Deep within the ship, the engines rumbled to life. The crew chose to depart under the cover of darkness, hoping the night and storm would conceal them from enemy eyes. At 7 p.m., Wilhelm Gustloff slipped her moorings and turned toward the open Baltic. Behind her, Gotenhafen's lights vanished into snow and darkness as the overcrowded liner steamed into the storm. On the bridge, 4 officers shared command, each with his own rank and conviction, yet none with absolute authority. The divided leadership stemmed from the ship's dual role as both civilian liner and military transport under Operation Hannibal, leaving her subject to 2 competing chains of command. Captain Friedrich Petersen, 63, the civilian master, oversaw navigation and seamanship. Beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, 33, head of the 2nd U-Boat Training Division, responsible for the thousands of military personnel on board. Their authority overlapped uneasily as Petersen commanded the ship itself, while Zahn commanded most of the people on board. 2 additional officers completed the uneasy quartet: Captain Veller, the navigator and officer of the watch, and Lieutenant Commander Paul Vollrath, who supervised the Women's Naval Auxiliary. Neither held final authority, yet both added to the tension on the bridge, where too many voices tried to guide a single ship. Together, they embodied the fractured command of a collapsing regime, as civilian and military leaders issued conflicting orders and debated how best to survive the frozen Baltic night. The argument began almost as soon as the ship cleared port. Zahn urged that they follow the coastline under total blackout to avoid Soviet submarines. Peterson refused, insisting that German minefields made the coastal waters far too dangerous. Zahn argued back that the lanes had already been swept and demanded they increase speed to 15 knots to outrun any threat. Peterson countered that Gustloff's long idle engines couldn't handle the strain and insisted on holding at 12. Neither man budged. In the end, they finally agreed on a compromise, a zigzag course through Route number 58, a mineswept corridor roughly 20 miles off the Pomeranian coast. It was meant to balance safety and stealth. However, it satisfied no one. As snow thickened around the ship, the confusion deepened. Peterson issued helm orders, Zahn directed military signals, and the others followed whichever voice seemed most certain. For a time, 2 torpedo boats and the passenger liner Hansa formed a small escort around Wilhelm Gustloff, guiding the defenseless cruise ship west toward the safety of Germany. The convoy held together briefly before the Baltic turned hostile. Snow thickened, fog rolled in, and the horizon vanished into white. Midway through the journey, Hansa and one of the torpedo boats developed mechanical problems and were forced to stop for repairs. Wilhelm Gustloff pressed on with her remaining escort, the torpedo boat Loa, straining through the worsening weather. Not long after, Captain Peterson received an unverified radio message warning that the deep waters ahead were mined, contradicting earlier reports that the route was clear. Fearing a fatal collision, the crew broke blackout orders and switched on the ship's navigation lights to scan the water for mines. The glow spilled across the sea, making Wilhelm Gustloff stand out clearly against the night. As the blizzard intensified, Lua surged ahead, possibly scouting for mines or seeking a more straightforward path. Moments later, it vanished into the snow. The 2 ships lost contact, and for the rest of the night, Wilhelm Gustloff sailed alone. With no escort to coordinate with, worn engines, and near zero visibility, the crew abandoned their planned zigzag maneuvers. They held a straight course through the open sea, since it was considered safer for navigation. As the storm worsened, the sea turned to slush, thick sheets of ice grinding against the hull. The decks were slick and overcrowded, making movement nearly impossible. Sailors tried to scatter sand for footing, forcing their way through the packed masses of refugees huddled together for warmth. The wind tore across the ship, and the hull groaned under the weight of so many bodies. Below deck, the boilers strained against the cold, but barely warmed the air. The heat vanished as soon as it left the pipes, as frost coated the bulkheads, spreading over valves, handrails, and even the metal floor. The corridors were so cold that fingertips numbed almost instantly, and each inhale sent a sharp sting through the chest. In the infirmary, conditions were worse still. The sick and frostbitten lay side by side on makeshift cots, as a young naval auxiliary moved quietly between them, rubbing salves in the cracked faces of children, and tending to mothers clutching their infants, some already still from the cold. Deep beneath the frozen Baltic, the Soviet submarine S-13 lay silent in the dark water. Its commander, Captain Alexander Marinesko, was known for sharp instincts at sea and a volatile streak that regularly put him at odds with the chain of command. Born in Odessa and trained in both the Soviet merchant fleet and the Black Sea Fleet, he advanced quickly because of his navigation skills and confidence under pressure. Yet away from the bridge, he was a chronic disciplinary case. He drank heavily, disregarded orders, and repeatedly tested his superior's patience. His crew trusted his judgment. Headquarters viewed him as a liability. He inflated his combat reports, pursued risky actions without permission, and even received the Order of Lenin for a commando raid that ultimately failed. By early 1945, repeated reprimands and alcohol-related incidents had pushed his career to the edge of collapse. Facing a likely court-martial for his behavior, Marinesko knew his command of S-13 might be the last chance he would ever get to repair his record. Determined to prove himself, and fueled by anger at what the German invasion had inflicted on the Soviet Union, he focused on the stream of German ships fleeing west across the Baltic. From his perspective, these vessels appeared as wartime targets. They were large transports, painted in military gray, crowded with uniformed personnel, armed with anti-aircraft guns, and often escorted. Nothing in their appearance suggested civilian evacuation. Everything signaled military value. Even if he had any doubts, to him, every ship in those waters was a rightful target. At that time, the Soviet Naval Command had issued a blunt order: sink anything German. S-13, the only surviving Stalinets-class submarine still operational in the Baltic, would hunt without restraint. Without waiting for approval, Marinesko set course toward Gottenhafen, intent on intercepting the refugee convoys escaping the Soviet advance. In the cramped torpedo room, his men had scrawled 4 chalk dedications onto their warheads, quote, "For the motherland, for Stalin, for the Soviet people, for Leningrad." For 3 fruitless weeks, S-13 prowled the Baltic's icy shallows. Then, on January 30th, as night fell over the Stolpa Bank, the sonar picked up the deep, steady thrum of German propellers. Marinesko raised the periscope. Through snow and fog, a vast ship appeared, its navigation lights glowing faintly in the dark. It was moving straight, fully lit, unaware of what waited below. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. S-13 turned to intercept. The crew stood rigid in the red-lit torpedo room, surrounded by the hiss of compressed air and the smell of oil and steel. 4 torpedoes waited in their tubes. At 9:16 p.m., he gave the order to fire. When the firing valves opened, the submarine shuddered 3 times in quick succession. The 4th torpedo, marked for Stalin, jammed in its tube, nearly detonating inside the sub. The other 3 sped away through the black water, closing 1,000 yards to their target within a minute. The first torpedo struck beneath the bow, ripping open the crew quarters and sending a shockwave through the ship. Men sleeping in the lower decks never woke. Steel and seawater tore through their cabins in an instant. Seconds later, the second torpedo slammed into the center of the vessel, shattering the engine room. Boilers erupted, and scalding steam filled the corridors. The lights flickered once and went dark, plunging the liner into blackness. Then the third torpedo hit. It smashed into the port side at the level of the drained swimming pool, where hundreds of naval auxiliaries and U-boat trainees were resting. The blast collapsed the deck above and sealed the space in fire and rising water, trapping nearly everyone inside. On the bridge, the explosions threw officers to the floor as alarms shrieked through the dark. Within moments, Wilhelm Gustloff began to list hard to port. Below, the third detonation had torn open the section housing the women's naval auxiliary, leaving them buried beneath twisted metal and flooding compartments. Families stumbled through flooding corridors, clutching children, slipping on oil and ice. The air filled with screams, smoke, and the sharp tang of seawater. Panic spread faster than the flooding itself, voices shouting for help, the groan of metal giving way, the crack of shattering glass. Men and women surged toward the stairwells in panic. The crush of bodies swept people off their feet, driving thousands toward lifeboats that could never hold them all. The ship had been built to carry just over 1,900 passengers and carried lifeboats for roughly that number. Now, with more than 10,000 aboard, escape was mathematically impossible. As the liner rolled hard to port, escape routes vanished. The tilt made it impossible to reach the port-side boats, leaving only the starboard craft accessible. Thousands pressed toward them, crushing one another in the surge. Even worse, the few available boats were frozen to their davits, their ropes hardened to ice. Crewmen hacked at them with knives and axes, while waves and sleet battered the deck, but the ice refused to break. Only 6 to 8 lifeboats were freed and launched. Many capsized in the rough seas, while a handful drifted away, already overloaded and barely stable. Sailors fired pistols in the air, trying to control the panic on deck, but the combination of ice, tilt, and sheer numbers made it nearly impossible. Some passengers, seeing no other way out, jumped into the sea on their own. Anyone who fell into the 4 degrees Celsius Baltic was overwhelmed within minutes. Most lost consciousness within 5 minutes. Very few lasted 10. The lifeboats that managed to launch struggled to stay upright, with survivors striking out with oars at desperate hands to keep from capsizing. Oil slick spread across the sea, ignited by flares and sparks, turning the water into a flickering sheet of fire. As Wilhelm Gustloff slipped beneath the Baltic, the noise faded into the wind. The cold consumed everything: sound, movement, hope, leaving only the faint glow of burning oil drifting across the frozen sea. Wilhelm Gustloff was gone within an hour. The sea fell silent but for the hiss of wind and the crackle of burning oil. Debris drifted across the dark water, including splintered wood, torn life jackets, scattered clothing, and the still shapes of those who had tried to swim. Just after midnight, the German torpedo boats Loba and T-36, followed by several minesweepers and small steamers, reached the scene. Their searchlights pierced the snow and fog, sweeping over what rescuers later called, quote, a floating graveyard. Only a few still lived, clinging weakly to overturned boats as the current carried them through the dark. Aboard T-36, the captain and his crew worked frantically to pull survivors from the freezing water, rescuing captains Wilhelm Zahn, Friedrich Petersen, and Heinz Weller, among several hundred others. Amid the wreckage, the rescuers faced impossible choices. With enemy submarines still feared nearby, they could not linger long in one spot. When a lifeboat showed no sign of life, they were forced to move on, leaving behind those the sea had already claimed. By 2:30 a.m., T-36 held nearly 500 survivors, many barely conscious. Crewmen gave up their own coats and poured vodka into trembling hands to revive the half-frozen. Historian Catherine J. Prince described the scenes as, quote, near medieval suffering. One survivor, Helga Reuter, recalled waving frantically from a raft as the ship passed near. Her fur-lined sleeves were the only reason her hands remained strong enough to catch the rope that saved her life. She was hoisted aboard, unable to stand, her feet already frostbitten. Nearby, Captain Paul Prüfer's torpedo boat, Loa, continued its grim search. It pulled 472 more survivors from the water, including those in lifeboat number 6, where Lieutenant Commander Paul Vollrath had kept morale alive by passing around cigarettes and a shared bottle of liquor. When their decks filled, they turned back toward Germany. Hours later, as Loa maneuvered among drifting lifeboats, explosions rumbled beneath the waves. She dropped depth charges in a final attempt to locate the attacker. The sea shook, but nothing surfaced. Beneath the waves, S-13 slipped away into the dark. Captain Alexander Marinesko never surfaced to confirm the ship's fate. From the periscope, he and his crew had watched the ship's lights disappear beneath the water, the explosions fading into silence, and that was all they needed to know. By dawn, the fires had gone out, and the Baltic lay still again. Hours after the ship went down, German rescue vessels carried the survivors to ports such as Kiel, Sassnitz, and Gottenhafen. More than 9,000 people, including 5,000 children, had perished in the freezing sea. It was a toll greater than the combined losses of the Titanic, Lusitania, and Empress of Ireland, making the sinking not just the most lethal night in maritime history, but the largest loss of life ever recorded on a single ship. Those lost were not only Germans, but civilians of different backgrounds caught in the collapse. The scale of the tragedy, especially in the number of innocents, defied comprehension. Yet in a world already drowning in tragedy, the catastrophe passed almost unnoticed. It was overshadowed by the war's final collapse, with the Red Army advancing from the east, Berlin teetering on destruction, and nations fracturing under the weight of defeat. Neither Germany nor the Soviet Union had reason to broadcast what had happened. One side had lost thousands of its own civilians, the other had slaughtered them. For both, silence was easier than shame.